In this video, I'll be revealing the 3 steps that I took in order to achieve a close to 200% weighted pull-up. Now you can implement these strategies as well, even if you're a complete beginner, to see rapid progress.
Now I've seen a lot of weighted pull-up videos, but this right here is crazy. Like, what does a 200% weighted pull-up even mean? Is bro really pulling double his body weight in actual loads? Or does he mean that he's pulling the total amount of weight, including his body weight and the added loads to the weighted pull-ups? Well, either way, we're going to find out. So let me stop yapping and let's get right into this video.
If you've currently never added weights to your regular pull-ups, what I would recommend is that you have a solid baseline of pull-ups. Here I would say 6 to 8 reps minimum, but ideally closer to 10 clean pull-ups. When I say clean pull-ups, I mean, slow and controlled, and you pretty much getting to the upper clavicle type chest area when you hit those pull-ups. The reason for this is quite simple. Even if you could start to load your pull-ups before getting to 10 plus reps, it's really important that we've got the technique nailed down. Once you start adding weight and stuff, we really want to make sure that the scapulars are working properly, that you depress and retract those shoulder blades before you start engaging in those pull-ups. There's no
so this is pretty much all valid. I'd say we on a good start so far.
Now for the first point, one of the fastest and most reliable ways to build strength and progress with the weighted pull-ups is to use what's called the Russian method. So with this method, what you want to do is that whilst maintaining good form, you want to increase the number of sets you do of a particular exercise up until a point where you can add another repetition. And you do this, you increase the sets and reps, you keep switching between these and gradually improving in sets and reps until you get to a point where you can make a larger jump in weight. So specifically for weighted pull-ups, I like to stick to 3 to 5 sets of 3 to 5 reps. What this means is that your first session for a particular weight would be 3 sets of 3 repetitions per set. Then next session you would do 4 sets of 3 reps per set, then 5 sets of 3 reps per set. And at that point, once you
this right here is sounding very familiar to what I do myself.
Doing 3 sets, but now 4 repetitions per set. Next session on, we'll do 4 sets of 4 reps, then 5 sets of 4 reps, and after that we go back to 3 sets, this time with 5 repetitions per set. Then up to 4 sets of 5 reps, and then 5 sets of 5 reps.
Now I do appreciate that the original creator is breaking down his progression scheme based upon priority, where technique is going to be the base of that hierarchy scheme that he's shown us. And essentially, this is going to be the foundation of your training, including the one of many ways of implementing progressive overload. So if your technique is trash, then one shouldn't even focus about the other variables, right? Then moving on to the next hierarchy is going to be sets. So in his example, increasing the number of sets while keeping the number of reps constant is the next shift of focus. So before you start even adjusting the number of reps or loads, you want to increase the number of sets first. And in his scenario, it's by working within the range of 3 to 5 sets. Then we eventually get to the loads as the final method to implement progressive overload. Now, if y'all didn't know already, for those who are, coming back to my channel, this is very similar to how I actually recommend and make programs centered around beginners who are trying to improve their strength in weighted calisthenics. So this can also apply to weighted chin-ups, weighted dips, weighted push-ups. It's not just specific to the weighted pull-ups. But the only difference between me and the original creator in terms of how I approach this progression scheme is that I actually like to keep the number of reps constant, meaning I don't change the variable of adjusting the number of reps. Rather, I keep it the same. But I do like to change the number of sets similar to how he does it. So in my case, I would recommend, of course, starting off with 3 sets, but this time just doing 5 repetitions. And eventually, once you perfect that load for 3 sets of 5 reps, you will move on to increase the number of sets by 1 by doing 4 sets of 5 reps, eventually to the point where you get to 5 sets of 5 reps. So it's similar to his in the sense of the progression scheme of increasing the number of sets, but I like to keep the reps constant, mainly because I found that it's not necessary to do his particular approach for, compound movements that doesn't really require much technical demand, right? I would say his progression scheme is more suitable for more skill-based movements or dynamic skill-based movements that's more technical in terms of the amount of technique and skill required to execute that movement, such as learning the handstand push-ups. So when it comes to like an individual who only has the strength of like doing one single handstand push-ups without the wall, and they want to get to a point where they're doing multiple repetitions, his particular progression scheme would be more suitable. Where I would kind of, start them off with doing multiple sets for one single rep, just to build that work capacity. So not to say that his is incorrect. I'm just giving my particular differences of opinion in terms of, what's more suitable based off what exercises you're training.
Once you get to the 5x5 point, you should be able to add about 10 kilos thereabouts onto your pull-up, and then go back to 3x3.
Now I'm gonna say that this method doesn't sound too bad. It's actually pretty good. Very similar to mine, like I mentioned earlier. So if anything, it's very promising for those who are just starting out their weighted calisthenics journey. However, this style of training or this progression scheme is purely depending on increasing your overall work capacity by adjusting volume, which, like I mentioned before, is very important and essential for inexperienced lifters on any given exercise to be able to improve their work capacity with that specific movement, which will then improve or increase their strength adaptations, because they will eventually understand that movement pattern. And also particular to, weighted calisthenics, not adding too much load too quickly. You would rather implement the variable of volume to implement progressive overload as a way to just hold yourself more accountable, to ensure that you're actually adjusting to the number of sets and you're making sure that you're executing the movement correctly before you start adjusting the loads, which I will say is also another variable for implementing progressive overload and increasing the intensity. But I will say whenever you increase the loads, it has a much more direct effect in terms of how intense it actually feels. Whereas if you're just increasing like the reps or the number of sets before the loads, the amount of intensity doesn't really hit you that hard, right? It's still obviously increasing the intensity, but it's just not as direct compared to increasing the loads. I hope you all understand what I'm trying to say. So this way, beginners, in a sense of being inexperienced with the weighted pull-ups, for example, are more likely to maintain their exercise composure when they begin to increase the loads, which will thus give that beginner to understand just how to handle more loads with much bigger jumps. However, the issue with this progression scheme is that eventually, once you progress to a specific threshold of working loads on the way to pull-ups or dips or whatever weighted calisthenic movement you're doing, you'll soon realize that that amount of volume that you're resorting to as a way to increase progressive overload and the duration of how long you train with that extended volume is going to soon take a hit on your CNS, and it's going to definitely take a dip to your performance, because you're just not going to be able to maintain that much load for multiple sets for an extended period of time, right? Like that's just something that you got to be wary of. Now, there's definitely multiple ways to manage fatigue, the fatigue that you've accumulated over previous sessions, which he honestly may or may not get into, but I just wanted to kind of point that out, that this particular progression scheme is gonna just have some, I would say, just gonna be an expiration date eventually.
Every 4 to 8 weeks, you do a deload or a rest week. So how do we look at this specifically? The way I think about it, every 4 to 8 weeks, it's a relatively big gap there. So it depends on how you eat, how you sleep, and how you train, and sort of how your energy levels are, right? The way I like to think about it is that if you have poor sleep, you have poor nutrition, and you are training very intensely or in such a manner where, or maybe even independently of your training, you're just generally very fatigued. Maybe you're also like very stressed and you're overworked, all of these types of things. If these factors coincide, I would take a deload as often as every 4 weeks. Whereas if your nutrition's on point, if you sleep really well, and you train intensely but you're not really fatigued outside of your training, in your general day-to-day life, then you can do a deload as rarely as every 8, perhaps even every 12 weeks for some machines out there.
All right, so now that we're on the topic of deloading, I will say that he does hit it right on the nail for this particular topic. But I do want to highlight that the reason why there's such a huge gap in terms of like how many training weeks a training block can consist of. And he mentioned, I believe, like 4 weeks up until 12 or 10 weeks. The reason why there's that big gap is because of this. The duration of one's training block really boils down to just how intensely are you training throughout that training block. Now, if you're an individual who has, relatively low training intensities throughout the majority of your training block, then it makes more sense that you're going to be able to train for much longer, given that you're going to have a much larger training block in terms of weeks, right? Now, on the other end of the spectrum, if somebody who's training, for the most part of their training block with higher intensities, then it makes more sense that they can't maintain that. So they would require a deload week much earlier. So their training block is going to be much shorter in terms of the duration, the number of weeks per training block. Hence why the progression scheme that he mentions that goes from 3 sets of 3, 3 sets of 4, 3 sets of 5, all the way up until 5 sets of 5. If you actually like add up the number of sessions, it's going to be about like 9 total sessions. Now, 9 total sessions, I don't know if that's 9 weeks, or maybe he's doing 3 by 3, then 3 by 4 within the same week. But either way, and I actually wouldn't recommend that either, unless you're like adjusting the loads. But either way, let's say we're taking the example 1 where each 3 by 3, 3 by 4, 3 by 5, like that's his own week. That's 9 total weeks. That right there is going to be indicating to me that the person will be training majority of the time with relatively moderate training intensities. So they won't really be training with high intensities until like the last part of the training block, like the last 3 weeks, to be honest. Once they're doing like 5 sets of like 3, 5 sets of 4, 5 sets of 5, right? So that's 3 out of 9 weeks. So this is the reason why that individual who utilizes progression scheme can go literally 2 months without needing a deload, because they're just not training that intensely, which isn't incorrect. Like I mentioned, this particular progression scheme calls for volume more than intensity to implement progressive overload, which is actually beneficial for beginners. Now, on the other hand of the spectrum, if you do want to train with higher intensities for the majority of your training block, then you got to understand that your training block duration is going to be much shorter. So you're going to be more required to take a deload week much earlier than someone who was training with moderate intensities for the majority of their training block, which goes to the whole purpose of knowing how to manage your training intensities, aka strength periodization. And the original creator doesn't explicitly mention this particular principle, but that's just because there's no need to, just because his strength progression scheme is more catered to beginners, and they're utilizing volume as a way to essentially manage their intensities, like overall training intensities for that training block. So there's no need for them to like get into the details of understanding what percentages they should be training at each and every single block, because they're not adjusting the loads, right? And this is all because like beginners, whenever they start to train for strength, they're actually indirectly learning how to gauge their training efforts. They're indirectly learning how to give an estimate of how much effort they're putting on exercise, hence RPE. It's more suited for like those intermediate and more seasoned lifters, right? And the whole reason why I'm bringing this up is because eventually that beginner is going to need to transition on to this top and back offset method, right? Something that's more catered to intermediate and advanced based lifters. Because now an individual who's now more seasoned and more experienced will be able to gauge relatively close how much effort they're putting on an exercise and be able to put that into the RPE energy, right? So 0 meaning it's very light, 10 meaning it's very heavy, and I couldn't even do another rep, let alone heavier loads, right? So that's where the experience comes into play. You gotta go through this transition of using volume to your advantage as a beginner, but you can only milk it out for so long while reaping results and not incurring too much accumulated fatigue, right? So then once you become more seasoned, you got to transition on to something that's more suitable for seasoned lifters. So this particular individual who's more experienced will be able to train at higher intensities with much fewer sets, actually, like 2 to 3 sets, like no cap. And specifically to the top set method, this is where one will put 100% of their efforts into one set, aka their heaviest set for a specific rep. And with the prerequisites of knowing how to properly load intensities, starting from the first week of your training block after you finish your deload week up until the last week of your training block, which is known as the peak week, where one will be able to perform an all-out set for their dedicated rep goal. And by the nature of going all out and putting 100% effort, it will be nearly impossible to do this for an additional set with the same loads, rep count, and technique. Otherwise, that top set that you thought was 100% effort really meant that it wasn't 100% effort. And if it was, then you would proceed to follow it with additional sets, but this time reducing the loads. So this right here will be known as the back off sets. And the back off sets are there for you to just get more volume, whether it's for hypertrophy benefits, whether it's for improving strength adaptations. You're just utilizing these back off sets to just ease up on the intensity in terms of the load and, perfect the movement, perfect the given exercise while you still hit your targeted reps, your targeted number of sets for the rest of the particular session. Now, I do want to say that I've deviated slightly from the original video in terms of like what he's specifically talking to, but I think this is very important to just highlight because here's the truth. There's a particular time and place for when a strength progression method will be the most optimal or suitable for an individual. And that's why I don't like to say just in general that this is the best progression method, because it really does depend on the individual basis and, given their strength level, their experience, what goals they have. And I'm not insinuating that the original creator did that, but I just wanted to kind of highlight that every particular progression method has its purpose, has its given time and place of when to apply it, and the amount of benefits and also how suitable it is for that particular individual will actually determine whether or not that person should do it. So yeah, all in all, I just wanted to point out that I think I highlighted some things that you viewers should be aware of whenever you use either my progression method, like the 3 to 5 sets by 5 reps, or his progression method, the 3 sets by 3 up until 5 by 5. Just keep in mind that there's going to be an expiration date. But hey, what do I know? If you want to see more content like this, be sure to follow me, man. I'm the Tough Fitness Scout. Shit, no cap.
Cobra trains. He's up next. Make sure y'all subscribe to him. He's number one out here.
He's the toughest fitness guy out here.